Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first Antisyphon Anti-cast of 2024. We got Jennifer Shannon here with us. She's teaching a class next week, and so in case you're like, this was fantastic, I would love to take a class with her, you can do that. But the other thing, too, is that we'll make sure that we share the link to the YouTube so that you can watch in case Zoom is having any issues today. We're on Discord, so if you haven't joined Discord yet, you always can. If you look on Zoom, there's a new button called Resources. So if you click on Resources, there's generally like 3 tabs at the top, like links and files and others. And so if at any time you need resources or links or the slides, you can go ahead and grab them from there. If you have questions at any time, feel free to ask them in Zoom or Discord. And then at the end, we'll do the best we can to do a Q&A session with Jennifer. Jennifer, do you have any questions before we get started?
I do not. Well, I have a question for the attendees, actually. I just kind of want to get like a general idea of how many people that are currently watching have used Burp or know about Burp, or how many people are completely new to it. Because the whole goal of this talk is really kind of driving into the new year. Um, People who might be looking to get into web applications or pen testing in general. So I'm kind of letting that drive a little bit.
I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up, so I think those
Awesome.
thumbs up are good. I'm heading backstage. We'll be listening in the entire time, Shannon. So if you or Jennifer, if you need anything, let me know.
Awesome, will do. So, new year, new skills. Before we get into why I've written this talk the way that I have, let me go ahead and give a little bit of background on me. Whoop. So, my name is Jennifer. I'm one of the senior security consultants at Secure Ideas. I like to jokingly say that we're a worldwide organization because we have one employee in Canada, but we are headquartered out of Jacksonville, Florida, and I'm one of the ones that lives in Jacksonville. So I'm one of the few people that get to go into the office regularly. I want to say the majority of our workforce is remote. Um, Industry experience. I got my degree in computer systems and networking and telecommunications. I started as a SOC network security analyst in a managed SIEM. So I was blue team at the very beginning. They needed somebody who could reverse engineer malware, and I got into I malware was one of my hobbies. I loved malware. I loved playing around with it. I had my own lab and everything set up already. So I ended up moving into that position where I was reverse engineering malware for many years and doing threat intelligence. And part of that also included pen testing. I did not think I was ever actually going to go into pen testing. It didn't seem like something that I wanted to do professionally. Even though it was something I loved doing, it was for me, I didn't want to make my hobby my career. Um, but slowly but surely, I did get into pen testing. They needed somebody who could do web applications. And weirdly enough, my experience of malware research prepared me for that. And I know that I took a little bit of a interesting route here. A lot of the people that I work with at Secure Ideas that do the web applications, they come from a background in development versus me, who came from a background of through researching exploit kits, I got really attuned to digging through websites, finding these vulnerabilities that were being exploited, ways that they were being used. Um, so I very much came from a deconstruction background versus the construction background whenever it comes to web applications. And I really wanted to share that because web applications can feel overwhelming, especially at the beginning, but you can still do them. Um, so some other interesting facts about me. I'm an all-around geek. I'm a collector of things. I have a lot of anime figures, lots of Fallout memorabilia behind me. I am a lockpick enthusiast. I do run the local chapter of Tool, which is the organization of open locks. And finally, a fun fact about me, the city of Jacksonville stole my driveway one time, and I'm not kidding. They did. Uh, and I do have pictures to prove it. They actually stole it twice. I had no idea. I was actually working overnights on a pen test at a time. So I also slept entirely through them stealing my driveway. And hilariously enough, it was like a week after I bought a new car for the first time. I'd only ever had like used cars. I bought a brand new one. I could not get out of my driveway because of the way that my yard was set up. So I will share some pictures. Yeah, no, concrete. Yes, they took the concrete and the street underneath my driveway. So they never even warned me, but I'll talk about that at the end. Um, Before we get into a little bit more. One of the things that I really, really want to preface this talk with is what is professionally evil? Secure Ideas, our motto is professionally evil. So what does that really mean? And it was, we think evil so we can understand how an attacker will behave and what they will attack. Some of you have probably heard this story before, but many moons ago, whenever I was working in retail at Dollar General, I was one of the managers, and part of my job was loss prevention. And they taught me to catch a bad guy, you had to think like a bad guy. And I had a really hard time with that mentality at first because I didn't speed, I didn't stay out past curfew, I tried very hard not to break laws because my entire life's existence has been geared towards not going to jail. Um, and so I had a hard time trying to figure out why people were stealing or what they would steal or how they would steal. And I spent probably a couple of months like really self-reflecting or going through and um, looking at each item in the store, trying to figure out if I was going to steal that, how would I steal it and why would I steal it? And that kind of really helped me to identify that razor blades were the most common thing stolen in my store because they were being used to open packages of other items to steal. Um, so having this adversarial mindset is really helpful whenever it comes to any type of red teaming. It helps me look at things as an attacker would. But again, it's really important that we are professional. Um, we don't want clients to walk away from a pen test feeling upset or confused or like they've been taken advantage of in any way. So we try to maintain that open line of communication. We want to make sure that we very firmly establish rules of engagement and follow what is in scope. We don't want to go out of scope because that's where you very, very easily can kind of get into some trouble. And, you know, I'm not going to lie, we've all kind of gone out of scope. I think Kevin likes to tell the story about the time he hacked a police department when the police department was not our client. It turns out that in some smaller towns, when there's a big provider that has a lot, like a big company that has a lot of the address space, they lease out some of that to smaller companies. And that's what we ended up finding and compromising, which we were not informed about beforehand. So we had to have a very fun meeting about that one. But permission is paramount. We don't want to do anything that we are not permitted to do. If there's ever any question about it, we want to make sure that we reach out to the client and confirm, just so that way they feel comfortable with what we're doing. So let's go ahead and move on. Writes down, don't hack a police station. That is very true. Definitely don't hack police stations unless you have been hired to do that. It's also important to note, I think some people mentioned earlier, none of our testing is ever meant to be damaging in nature just because we don't want to break anything. We want to find how it could be broken, but we don't want to actually take you offline for a day or longer. So what about why is pen testing web applications important, and why is it something that you should probably look at doing internally? I don't even remember where I found this GIF. It was something that I found it and I saw it and I was like, oh, this is hilarious. And it kind of ended up being the driving factor behind a lot of this talk. It's relying on the annual pen test for security. There are a lot of companies that do come to us. They're only once a year, and it is just to check off. We're just a check mark in a box, and that's fine. But especially whenever it comes to applications, there's a lot more to it than just getting that tested yearly. One, the threat landscape changes so rapidly, and services, and I'm going to pick on JavaScript a lot. JavaScript and jQuery are easy findings for us. We very regularly find that there's outdated or vulnerable versions of it, but these things kind of come and go so fast that if you're only looking at them once a year, you're doing yourselves a disservice, because it very well could turn out that during that first pen test you have, there's nothing wrong with it. But, 3 weeks after you get the report and we finish the remediation testing, a major vulnerability is going to drop for a CK editor, or let's say a SQL that is, oh, it is an annual too short. You could replace an annual pen test with a lot of things, actually. Yes. And so the reason why we at Securities are very passionate about trying to teach as much of our skills as possible is because we want people to be able to do what we do. We want people to be able to assess their security much more consistently. Some companies just don't have the bandwidth or the technical know-how to do any type of internal testing. But if you learn those skills and you're able to facilitate it, you can do small internally vulnerability assessments throughout the year. Or if you're updating it, you can do some quick checks for it beforehand, before you get to the pen test. And one, this will save you a lot of time and heartache in the end because you'll probably be able to identify some of these major vulnerabilities before they really happen. Or before they're discovered by an attacker, or before they end up in a pen test where we inadvertently compromise not only you, but an entire police station. I'll give an example. Not too long ago, we had a client that we believed was vulnerable to Log4j. We submitted the payload and 2 shells opened. And it turns out that this was being passed on to a third-party vendor, and the third-party vendor was also vulnerable to it. So we inadvertently compromised a third party. Again, sometimes stuff like that happens. That was a case where we stopped testing. We got in contact with the client and said, "Hey, let's talk about this. Let's go ahead and figure out how to reach out to the vendor. We can't do it on your behalf because of an NDA, but we will assist you in doing it." Yeah, 2 birds, 1 stone. For sure. So before I get into some of the fun little tips and tricks, if you're looking at getting into pen testing, either as a hobby or as a career choice, or even if you're looking to get into bug bounties, I kind of want to go over a little bit about the methodology that we use during a pen test before we start really getting into the tools. And I share the methodology because this is kind of really a good guidebook. And I'm going to share something that I was told right before my first ever pen test. 5 attempts or 5 minutes. It's really easy to lose a whole day on thinking, okay, this search, if I do this, I get an error message and it tells me there's my SQL under there, and I absolutely should be able to get a SQL injection here. It's so easy to lose a whole day on something like that. So usually whenever I am going through to make sure that I'm able to test a web application completely, I follow the 5 attempts or 5 minutes. So I'll start going through it piece by piece and attempting what I need to attempt on each different component of it. If there's something that I feel like I should be able to get, but I'm kind of reaching the end of that, then I will make a note of it to circle back to once I have completed testing of the application, and then I can spend more time on it, because that way I'm not wasting a whole day, not getting anywhere, and then accidentally leaving out several pages of the web application, leaving them untested because I spent so much time on this one search functionality. Yeah, somebody said recon never finishes. This is completely true. And I will also point out that this is cyclical in nature. So this is not a do one, then the other, then this, and then that. They very much relate to each other very strongly, and you will move back and forth between these stages quite rapidly during a pen test. It's just the easiest way to kind of break it down. So let's get into reconnaissance a little bit. This is really your information gathering phase. Using search for public sources, things like Shodan, Amass. Sorry, I just completely forgot the word for that one. Amass is really good for finding subdomains. Gathered information can include both technical and non-technical details, such as, and here we have listed IP addresses, subdomains, employee names, email addresses, usernames, passwords from previous breaches. Something that I will always look for is username and password breaches. One, because it might give me an idea of how their usernames are set up. And if I can use that, then it'll make it a lot easier for me to try and set up some sort of brute forcing or username enumeration. How would I handle accidentally breaching a third party if you were doing a bug bounty? So please forgive me, I don't do bug bounties myself. I know a few people that have professionally, and this is a question I should ask them actually. So I think it's very heavily going to depend on how that bug bounty program is set up. If it is one that is very publicly available, um, you might you probably would not be breaking a non-disclosure agreement by reaching out to the third party. And you could probably reach out to the third party without directly saying, oh, this is the app I was testing. But first step for me, usually, I'm very pro conscientious or responsible disclosure. So I would probably reach out to that company. You might also look to see if they have any bug bounties out in the open that or bug bounties available as well. But I would probably try to reach out to them and say, hey, I was doing this unassociated thing and I noticed this with yours. Uh, I just thought you should know about it. But I think really that's kind of going to come down to a personal decision for each person. Somebody said by getting glasses. I would like to say that today's my first day wearing contacts again. After a week, I had to wear glasses for a while, and I do not like my glasses. And yes, I've been wearing glasses since I was 5 years old. Let's see. The This is usually the first phase of any type of pen test. The big reason for this is, again, it kind of gives us a good idea of what we might be walking into. We can do a lot of reconnaissance without ever actually touching the application itself, but it's also important to note that there is a difference between passive reconnaissance and active reconnaissance. Active is when you're going to actually be interacting with it, something like in-map, which also falls very closely into the mapping stage of it, versus using publicly available tools, like just going and looking at LinkedIn or something like that to see if there's any employees that are there. And of course, if you message any of those employees, I think that you move from the passive. So finally, I have mapping tasks, and this is important. Usually, this is going to be the first time. Usually, how long does it take to be kind of happy with my reconnaissance? So this is going to depend very heavily on engagement to engagement. There are some tests where they will give us their external IP addresses and say, okay, these are where all of our web apps are hosted. So here's this range where all of our web apps are. Go find what you can. Come back to us at the end of it and we'll validate what you found, if it's in scope or not. In those cases, I feel like I'm never happy with it, that it's never enough, that I could always find more. And then there are other cases where they're like, okay, we want you to only look at this one page on this one specific web app, in which case you should still be doing the basic reconnaissance tasks. That's not a indicator of you should skip it. This is a stage that's very often skipped for that reason, is it feels like you shouldn't be doing any reconnaissance for that. But doing basic tasks like looking at any open ports or any other version histories, or just getting a general idea of the application as a whole, can really point you in the right direction, especially if through that reconnaissance you find maybe additional technologies you weren't aware that were there beforehand. So in those cases, usually I'm pretty happy with whatever reconnaissance I end up doing, just because the test itself did not require as much of that thought and input as some of the other ones do. And there is a saying with malware analysis, and I will say this whenever it comes to pen testing as well, the engagement drives the tooling. So there are times, a tool that I use in every engagement, give or take, is Burp. There's been very few times where I have not used Burp for a web application. But I don't need to use something like a mass or trying to think of another one off the top of my head, and I cannot for some reason, on every web application pen test. Yeah, Nikto is another good one. We have also, we have Nessus license that we use. And while we're on this, I do want to go ahead and say a quick caveat. There is a difference between vulnerability assessments and an actual pen test, because we do perform both of them. Vulnerability assessments, as you know, very high level. They go through and look for indicators of vulnerabilities that might be there, but the pen test is actually trying to exploit those vulnerabilities and see if we can actually leverage them in some way or another. I have used Nikto before. I use Nessus also on a good chunk of my pen test, just because it is a good way for me to kind of narrow in on some interesting facets that maybe I wasn't seeing beforehand very quickly. And I will say most of my bigger findings that I get from a Nessus scan aren't necessarily like, oh, SQL injection here. I had one not too long ago where it was like, oh, browsable web directory, which I think is like a medium according to Nessus. I go look at the browsable web directory and I find that they had a SQL database connection set up through a CGI script that I was able to call. And I was able to get that and find all the database information and the username and password. So then I was able to connect to the username or to the database without an issue. At which point, turns out it was one of their employee management databases. So I could have added myself as an administrative user at that point, but what I did instead was I reached out to the client and said, hey, this is what I found. This is how I found it. We could give ourselves administrative credentials at this point. Would you like us to create an account, or do you want to create one for us, or is this sufficient for you? And they came back saying, no, they didn't want us to try and add an account in case we messed something up, but that they would elevate one of our accounts to an administrative level for us since we had sufficiently proven that we would have been able to give ourselves administrative privileges. Oh yeah, somebody, hey, I just pwned you, give me money and I'll show you how. Somebody mentioned that you shouldn't say that for bug bounty targets. I I do agree with that. One of the big reasons for that being is that one, I think bug bounties currently are in a stage of trying to become legitimate and more recognized as a avenue for some form of security. And if we, as an industry, want to ensure that that happens, we should treat them professionally as well. Yep. And again, that really kind of comes back to whenever I'm working on an engagement, I try very hard to communicate with the client. I want them to feel comfortable with what I'm doing. I want them to have confidence in the report they're getting at the end. And I we try very hard that our clients feel like they've got one of the best experiences they could possibly get at the end of it. And part of it is making sure that the client's comfortable. Because to be honest, when you come in for a pen test, we're about to go in and tell them that their baby is ugly, basically. And some parents are like, yeah, no, my baby's totally ugly, thank you. And other ones are going to be extremely defensive. So a lot of times making sure that we approach it from the perspective of somebody who's trying to help them versus somebody who's trying to just prove that they're really bad at their jobs is very important. Yep, baby is ugly. Also, nuclei, I have used that. It's been a little bit. Nuclei was pretty fun to work with. Also, mapping tasks. Again, usually this is the first time that we're really going to be interacting with a web application. I also want to go ahead and state that, oh, repeat the question for the folks that are not looking at Discord. Yes, sorry, I tried to repeat the questions and I totally did not. And I do not even remember which question I answered a minute ago because of the ADHD. Let me scroll back up real quick. I think somebody was asking, they were talking about that it was a good idea to talk to the client before trying to add myself into the system because they might have compliance or policies that say accounts will only originate from our HR system and sync to Active Directory. So one thing I will say that whenever before a pen test actually starts, we always go in and validate the credentials. So we want to make sure that the day of testing that we're able to hit the ground running, for lack of better words. And something important is that very first time that you're signing into an application, it's very common to not think about trying to capture that traffic or look at that traffic. But there are some cookies that are set the very first time an account is signing in that you might miss. So those are stages that I always like to try and interact with, analyze, and look at because it again can give me a lot more insight into how the application itself works. Let's see. Yeah, and we have noted here that this is critical. This is the build for the foundation of the test. This is true. My very first step, once I've signed in and everything, the pen test is underway. A good chunk of my first day is spent learning how to use the application as it's intended to be used by a regular user. And during this, I'm looking for boundaries that might be keeping me from accessing other tenants, or boundaries that indicate that, oh, this is a limited user, but that one's an administrative user. I'm trying to identify these boundaries that I can step across. Um, I'm also looking at the technologies that are used, how the information's flowing through this web application. And another reason why this is very important, you always want to submit benign payloads or regular traffic before attempting any type of attack, and monitor how that traffic behaves, because there's a lot of times that, for example, an online store, all of the store is hosted by, let's say, example.com, but maybe they use a Toast API for their payment services, or they have a third party like PayPal that they use just for their checkout process. PayPal and Toast wouldn't be in scope for that engagement. So you want to make sure that if I submit my credit card information, is it just going to example.com, or is it also going to PayPal? We want to make sure. I think that there's a very common saying for people who are into guns. I'm not a gun person, I'm sorry, but the be aware of your target and what lies beyond it. That applies to pen testing. You definitely want to make sure that you know where this is going to end up before you submit something um, potentially dangerous. Somebody asked if there are laws involved with these discoveries of exploits and vulns. I do not know. That's going to depend very heavily on, one, where you're located, and two, how the company itself will choose to respond to it. Yes. There are some companies that will react just fine. They will do what they can to rectify the situation. They'll be thankful that you helped them find it. Some other companies are just going to ignore you and blow you off. But, if you want, you can move on and say, okay, well, I told them, I waited, I made sure that they had plenty of time. Let's go ahead and do whatever now. And then there are going to be some companies that might take it very personally that you have done something intentionally or unintentionally. I will not name any companies, but I have seen some companies in the past that have reacted very negatively to it. But again, I think as the bug bounties become more common, that viewpoint and culture is kind of starting to change. So I think that as time goes on, we'll start getting more and more positive reactions versus those negative, I'll see you in court reactions. Haha, yes. Sorry, one of my coworkers just brought me a drink because I was really thirsty. Yep, somebody says you can get sued. It just depends on their mood. Yep, another ginger ale. And yes, it does depend on their mood. But again, I think part of it is once bug bounty programs really, really start to be seen as more professional, then that'll be less common than it was in the past. Somebody says, I know product placement when I see it. So next up, we have discovery. And I'm going to go ahead and say it. Discovery and the exploitation phase very often feel like they're hand in hand, because they are. This is usually the longest part of any test. And it's focused very heavily on finding the potential flaws and issues. So if I notice that, okay, during the mapping, I noticed that if I did something just wrong, or added this in just this way, I would get this error message. So what can I do with that? I'm seeing that I'm getting a database. Let's see if I can figure out what database is underneath it. Let's see if I can find any ways to bypass filtering. And this is very heavily focused on, again, context. They say the application context. What does the application do? How does the application work? And this is, I promise, related to this. One of the questions that we always like to ask is what is the most important, like what is the worst case scenario for you? And for most companies, you're going to be like, oh, employee information or social security numbers or payment information. But we have clients that have come back and said, oh, if you're able to access somebody else's recipe, that's game over for us, or phone numbers. And a lot of times it's because they are holding either really confidential or proprietary information and like celebrity phone numbers. And so if those phone numbers get out, they owe whoever celebrity or whichever celebrity whose number was leaked, they owe them millions of dollars. So that's something that we want to look at. And I'm going to use another example. On a test that I was on recently, the way that that industry was set up, social security numbers had to be plainly visible. So being able to see the social security numbers in the web application was not actually a finding in that case, because the web application was designed to do that. So it's really important to think of the context of the web application. Somebody said gasp, and I'm assuming it's in response to the plain text social security numbers, and I can say that was an industry specific requirement. Some industries require social security numbers to be tied to everything, and that they have to be very clearly available. Yep. Somebody asked, do you think starting a career as a pen tester is good, or something much simpler would be like Blue Team or something else in your mind? And I'm going to call on that one too, because somebody mentioned earlier that Blue Team isn't that simple. I will say again, I've been on both sides of that. I was Blue Team and now I'm Red Team. I sleep a lot better now that I'm Red Team. There was so many nights that almost every night I would go home from work and think, okay, did I make the right call on that? Or was that network packet actually suspicious and I just missed it? And, or, oh my gosh, what if I actually missed all of these indicators? Or what, I told this client there was no malware on that machine, but maybe I was wrong. I still, at the end of an engagement, there's usually about a day of thinking, I could have done more. If only I'd done this, or if only I'd done that. But that does not keep me up nearly as much as the Blue Team aspect did. And something that I always try to stress during a pen test engagement: attackers have all the time in the world. I have between 3 to 10 business days to find as many vulnerabilities as I can. That is one of the main reasons why I think I'm a lot less stressed about the Red Team, is that there is that knowledge that if I don't find something, either there's a good chance that it just wasn't there before, or somebody was able to spend 3 months on it before they actually cracked it. So we moved on to exploitation. This is the final step. This is the fun part for everyone. Usually this is whenever I finally submit that 1 = 1 and get back, I've signed in as an administrator. This, again, also depends very heavily on the flaws that are discovered. There are, again, sometimes where just a proof of concept is enough. A lot of times, I'm going to use the external XML entity injections as an example. The most effective way to test that is something called a billion laugh attack, which is a denial of service attack. We do not do any type of denial of service attacks. So if I can just prove, hey, I know that this parser is here, it reacts this way when I do this, I'm not going to do a denial of service for it, but you should think about implementing these. And it's also important to note, sometimes the exploitation phase will send you right back to the reconnaissance phase. Sometimes once I submit that 1 = 1, the error I get back indicates there's not actually a database there or something like that, but there's actually this other technology going on. And so, okay, let's go back to the reconnaissance. Let me look into this technology a little bit more. Let me start interacting with it and see what else information I can get from it. And then we go back to the discovery and exploitation. Yeah, I would ask, somebody says that I would ask the client or owner of the web app you're working with, if you find a potential remote code execution on a login page due to, say, an outdated software package, that's different than if you find an RC as an already authenticated administrative user. Again, when in doubt, I always try to reach out to the client, especially with something like a remote code execution. Some clients are real finicky about the idea of me maybe putting or executing code on their servers. So if I say, hey, I found this, and this indicate that remote code execution would be successful as an external attacker. How do you want to handle this? Sometimes they'll come back and say that is enough. And sometimes they say, we want you to see how deep that rabbit hole goes. No breaks on QA was another comment. And I would like to say for anybody who's on an internal team that's not necessarily pen test or red team driven, along the development lifecycle, any QA stage is a stage for security. One of the things that we have said a lot is that as a pen tester, I'm glorified QA. I'm QA on steroids. So any stage where you're doing any type of quality assurance or anything like that, you're able to go through and maybe implement some small security checks. And then at the end of the day, hopefully your applications will be a little bit more secure for it. Let's see. So I'm going to do a quick time check. Okay, yeah, we're doing good. So I just want to go ahead real quick and go through some of my favorite tips and tricks for anybody who uses Burp regularly. These are the tips and tricks that have honestly been a lifesaver for me. Oh yeah, somebody said glorified tech support or customer service. Yes, a surprising amount of my job is interfacing with clients. So regex. Regex. I remember the first time I ever looked at regex. And then I remember the last time I had to look up regex because again, this meme is very accurate in the times I've used regex and the times I've had to learn it. I do really like regex though. And one of the biggest reasons for it is in Burp, you can do a search using regex. One thing that you'll just need to keep in mind with this though is that whenever you're doing the search, you'll need to make sure that under options you've selected regex. But there are two ones that I do on every engagement. So we have one that we use internally for information disclosure, and I want to say this one was very much thanks to one of my fellow consultants named Bill. Cannot say how much easier this made my life once he shared this one with me. And I don't know, this one really opened up like a whole lot of other possibilities because I had not considered using regex for searches. What this does is it goes through and will look for, you can see right there, it has the X powered by the VMware content WordPress. Essentially what this is going to look for is any place that might have server information or information about the underlying infrastructure that was not immediately apparent. So somebody says, what do you do for post exploitation? That depends. Some exploits are going to be very small, like a brute force or let's say username enumeration. In that case, I usually provide the clients with a daily update, letting them know, hey, we found this here. And that's just an email that I send out either at the end of the day or the next morning. And during the report cycle, I will list out the steps of exactly how I did it so that way they can recreate it themselves. For really big ones that seem that would be critical, let's say that, oh, if I do the SQL injection, I get way more than I thought I was going to get and everything's on fire. That is I stop testing, I call the client, I tell them they have something that they need to look at. So it kind of really heavily depends on the severity of the issue on what I do with it after that. So somebody says finding a boundary in a post exploitation is probably tough. Assuming you were only on a contract for a web app, does that include the backend DB? And what if it contains other info? So something to keep in mind during this, and this is especially true for APIs. Or login processes, or like I said earlier, the checkout processes, and why it's important to map out that application and monitor where all that traffic's going. It's very common where they will be going and talking to something completely different. It's very common for API endpoints to be different than what the web application itself is. In those cases, I'm going to reach out to the client and say, hey, we noticed that this API endpoint has this URL, but the web application you've asked us to test has that URL. Should it be considered in scope for this engagement, or do we consider it outside of scope? A lot of times they'll say, oh, no, we don't control that. Don't touch it. And so we'll make sure that we're not submitting any payloads to that. And sometimes if we find that we might be able to access an internal resource, again, it's having that open communication with the client is very handy there. Let's see. So back to the information disclosure, this is just a good way to find some very quick information about what services might be running. Again, the screenshot here isn't super interesting because it's just Firefox, but I have seen specific versions before of Nginx being used. And a lot of times whenever we see those specific ones being used, they're very outdated. That lets me find some exploits or proof of concepts that I might be able to use or leverage during the pen test. And then I also have cores. Now, I will say there are tools, especially of Burp Suite Professional. Some of the extensions are pro only, but Burp Suite does have quite a few extensions that are available for the community edition as well. And there are other tools that do also check for cores or CSP a little bit better than just this regex does. But the reason why I like this is that if I'm talking specifically about, oh, your cores lets this happen or lets that happen, it having that screenshot for the report or for the client is very handy for showing them exactly what the issue is. So I like this regex because it not only finds it for me, but it highlights everything that I need to be able to show the client. Search and replace. So search and replace, there are a few options in Burp where you can go, there are default ones. And if you look at them, they have the item that it's replacing, such as the request header, and it's going to replace whatever user agent is there with specific user agents to emulate either Android or iOS or Internet Explorer. Are outdated software is common to come across in web apps? Yes, absolutely. The actually, I very frequently we are finding lack of application patching, outdated jQuery, outdated JavaScript, end of life JavaScript in a lot of places. That is very common, and especially companies that maybe aren't as dedicated to security as they should be. You can definitely tell a lot of times the companies that are trying versus the companies that are not. So these filters, these match and replace, they're disabled by default, but they perform basic tasks. I mention this because once I've developed a really good understanding of how the application works, I can see a lot of times in some sort of cookie or headers that it'll say something like, is admin false? I'm going to change the is admin from false to true for all of my payloads for a day or two, just because a lot of times the application is going to react in a way that you're not expecting it to, that can reveal some more information. I have given this as a generic example. There's quite a few times where it's put a little bit different, instead of like is admin 0 or admin 1 or permission level 0, permission level 1. That's why it's important to have done the mapping, because once you identify those, you'll be able to customize that search and replace much more effectively. So somebody says, so when you go for an API endpoint pen test, is there any particular list you follow if there's nothing obvious to go for, like the OWASP top 10 or something? The OWASP top 10 is a very good guide point, especially if you're very new to web apps or API pen testing. I will say it's not like the end all be all, but it is very helpful. I can make sure that if I'm going down that list that, okay, I've hit this, I've hit this, I've hit this, I've hit this. And another thing, Securitas has something called the BIO classification, which is bypass, input, logic, and oh no, I just forgot what the E stood for. Oh no, Jason Gilliam's going to be very upset with me, but we also use that for each page. I'm going to say, okay, is there a way for me to, let's again, search functionality. Is there a way for me to bypass any filters or security put on this? How is it going to handle input manipulation? What about logic and timing? And I cannot believe I just forgot the E. Oh my goodness. Um, wow. That's embarrassing. Yes. I will say there is a white paper we have posted about the file on our website. I will share a link to that after the webcast is over, so that way you can go look at it more. But for each interaction that I have, we can use that to kind of make sure that we're going through everything. And it's not like a comparative to the OWASP top 10, is something that works in conjunction with it. And then also, somebody, like I said a minute ago, somebody was asking about APIs, undocumented APIs, find references. This exposure, yes. Oh my goodness. Uh, Thank you, somebody else. Um, so it's very common that we'll find API endpoints during a web application pen test, because I don't know if you know this or not, APIs make up roughly 80% of our web traffic currently. They are the background of modern web applications and mobile applications and applications in general. Very frequently, though, we will know there's an endpoint there, but there's no documentation for it. We don't actually know how to use it. The client doesn't have any documentation for it that they can share with us. I always go through and find references. It's just in the engagement tools. Once you've picked a specific URL, just right click on it, engagement tools, find references, and it'll present you a nice list of all of these different scripts that are being called or will reference specific things. Once I go start digging through those scripts, very frequently I will find that the API itself, the query to the API, is being constructed in one of those scripts. And so that helps me figure out how to interact with the API. Somebody says that you can always try looking for WSDL and Swagger files too. That is very important. That is a very, if I think there's an API component, that's something that I'm absolutely going to be looking for during the reconnaissance and mapping phases for sure. And again, unfortunately, and I find this is an issue most commonly with GraphQL APIs, that there's not any documentation. They are very hard to enumerate or brute force just because the way GraphQL exists. So finding those references make it so much easier. And unfortunately, I don't have any good examples that I can share right here just yet, because all of the examples that I have found that have saved my butt whenever it comes to interacting with an API from finding the references were very hard for me to sanitize. So I will try to find some that do not contain client data. So you guys read code? Yes, I do. A large part of what I do in a web app pen test is looking at either the HTML or the scripts. Whenever I'm doing a test, I usually have the console development tools in Chrome or Firefox open while I'm interacting with the web app for that reason. I want to go on the record again and say I do not have a background in development. I can write some Python scripts that are really bad and really ugly and somewhat work, but they work somehow. But learning how to read code and scripts was very important for being able to do web app pen test, because it also helps me find areas. Are there any suggestions for tools to deobfuscate JavaScript? ChatGPT, somebody said ChatGPT. I will go ahead and give a minor warning on that one. I can't use ChatGPT for that reason because, again, NDAs, I can't be putting any type of potential client data in a place that I do not control. So ChatGPT itself does not work for me. But it will, some people, if you have your own web app, you can freely do that. It's not an issue. You're not at a potential for going out of a contract with yourself. But for anybody who's ever used it, there is a tool list for a Linux distribution called Remnux. They have quite a few deobfuscation tools in there that you can go look at. And I used to use those all the time whenever I was reverse engineering malware. And somebody says, if you notice a web app doing server client stuff, but you can't find anything on the DevTools network tab nor on the console, where would you look? That is That's a good question again, because that's very heavily, I think, per web app. That's one of those times where I'm probably going to start looking through the source code to see if I can figure out what it's doing, where it's doing it, and why it's doing it that way. Um, Hopefully I'm able to find it. Again, this where regex kind of comes in very handy is if I'm searching through stuff, I can kind of narrow things down a little bit faster, especially if I have an idea of what I'm already looking for. Um, and hopefully somewhere in there that I'll be able to find some form or some section that will indicate what I'm trying to find out more about. Somebody asked Roomnex or Flare VM, completely unrelated. That is a personal preference. I used both of them for different things. I used the Flare VM for rootkit analysis, and my Flare VM was my only malware machine that was connected to the internet. All of my Roomnex machines were not connected to the internet in any way. So I liked both of them. It was just for different reasons. Hotkeys. Yep, somebody gave the FYI 9 minutes left. We're getting close to the end. I promise. Hotkeys. I'm going to go over these real quick. You can go to settings, user interface, hotkeys. Burp will show you a lot of their pre-configured hotkeys, or you can configure your own. But I'm sharing these because my favorite one is Control R, send a repeater. Control Shift R will take you to repeater, and Control F will forward the intercepted proxy message. This is something that I'm constantly having to fight whenever I am teaching a class, because you guys can't see which keys I'm pushing whenever I'm using hotkeys. So I'm trying to always remember to hit the button so people can see what I'm doing. But man, these really, they're minor, but they are a huge quality of life improvement for me. Also, as far as repeater goes, I, again, as an ADHD person, am guilty of having a ton of tabs open at all times in Android. I don't know if you know this or not. If you have more than 100 tabs open, it doesn't count them anymore. It just turns into a happy face. So as you might notice, my repeater tabs tend to be the same, largely because it's where I hold stuff. It's where I am constantly keeping stuff for some reason or another. And it was not uncommon to see repeater tabs like this in my burp. And then I found out a couple of years ago, you can rename the tabs. And that has been a life changer for me. I still have 60 to 100 tabs open, but now they all have names, so I can at least kind of go find what I'm looking for pretty quickly. All you got to do is just double click on the tab number and type in whatever you want to name it. That is the thing that has probably been the biggest quality of life improvement for me. And I definitely try to share that one as much as possible, because I don't know how I didn't know that sooner. And then finally, let's go ahead and see some pictures of my driveway while we have any other question, while we take a few minutes to see if we have any other questions. Do I name them during recon or discovery? So I will say I don't name all of my tabs, but I name the ones that I know that I'll be returning to for some reason or another. And I name them as I go. Somebody said you can name browser tabs as browser windows as well, and group tabs, and name all that. I didn't know you can name them, but I have started using groupings. Somebody asked if I slept through that. Yes, I did. I'm a very heavy sleeper. Very much so. It is a running joke here at Secure Ideas that I would sleep through just about anything. When I was in high school, I fell asleep in the middle of a Dungeons and Dragons session one time, and they lit me on fire, and I did not wake up. They had to put me out. So, yes, I'm a very heavy sleeper. And what ended up happening was they were replacing the sidewalk, and my house in the neighborhood is the only one that's on a hill. So my driveway was the only one that needed to be torn out to even the sidewalk. Everybody else got to keep their sidewalks as they were. It's just they never informed me. And I also had at that time something like 27 trees in my front yard alone. There was no room for me to drive my car across the front yard just to get it onto the street anyway. So I had to rent a car for about 3 weeks.
Part of me loves this story for some reason. I don't know what that says about me. And sorry. Hello everybody, and thank you so much. We're do a little bit of Q&A, but before we do, first of all, thank you for joining us. If this was your first time, you're on Discord, type the word first just so that we know that you're here, and maybe that breaks the ice. And so next time you actually start with the back and forth comments. We appreciate you being here. So just put first in the Discord server. Jennifer, I'm gonna ask you a couple questions and then we'll but like we have to wrap up in 5 minutes, and then if
Yeah.
you can stick around, we'll stick around for a little bit. I do want everyone to know that we have the Offensive Summit coming up, Bypass Security Edition. And so if you don't know what that is, I'm going to put the link inside Discord, but now you're all like saying first. So I'm going to put it into the Anti-cast resources channel. And so that is a free summit coming up. And if you would like to submit for the CFP, we'd love to have you share your knowledge with the InfoSec community, especially here. All right. Jennifer, first question. Are you
Yes.
ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one, it said rookie question. How often are you asked to use special HTTP headers identifying yourself as a tester, and how would you actually go about that?
Actually, that is a good question. I have never had to. Nobody's ever actually asked me to do that before on an engagement. I will say though, that might just be because of the engagements that I'm on. One, I've given them my IP addresses and everything beforehand. So if they see any traffic from that, they will know it's me. But if you had to add in a specific header, that's something that very easily could be added in with that match and replace in the burp search and replace functionality or match replace functionality. You very easily be like, okay, if you see this, just add this and then this line that says header tester 1234.
Yeah.
Somebody said they did it in the user agent header. That's I think would be a good place for it. Sorry.
No worries. If you feel like your question wasn't answered during the webcast, because sometimes, like Jennifer, you were just back and forth with everyone.
Yep.
So if you feel like your question wasn't answered, go ahead and either add it into Zoom or into Discord, and we'll see if we can catch that. Quick question. Do you recommend using a private burp collaborator server over the default public server?
So personally, this is something that internally at Securitas, we've actually been debating for a very long time, again, because we try very hard to keep client information off of resources that we do not directly control. And collaborator, while we do trust Burp and all of that, it's a gray area. So in those cases, we have actually preferred in as many cases as possible to try to use our own resources where possible, but the private one I think would also be just fine. We've been talking about setting up private ones as well for that reason.
Yeah. All right. So we're wrapping up the official time that we have because we'll end here in 2 minutes. But what I'd like to do is like give you an opportunity to just give your final thoughts. If anyone has just one takeaway from today, there was over 700 people here today. And so for the 700 people who attended,
Woo!
What would you like to say to them to just wrap up everything that you've discussed?
I'm actually going to feed off. Somebody asked a question, and that was the big reason why I kind of really wanted to do this. When somebody said, what do you find is the best way to learn about web apps, APIs enough to do these engagements without having a dev background? It very heavily kind of relates to that. I wanted one to share that you don't necessarily have to have that development background to start pen testing web apps. I know a lot of like college or pen testing classes focus very heavily on the network aspect of it, but web apps are very important and do need all that love and care as well. So the main focus for today was mostly I'm hoping to inspire people that are looking to maybe get into web application pen testing. One, that they can do it despite their background, and two, that here are just some helpful things that I've learned along the way that made my life so much easier. And as far as what helped me get here, I will say my amount of running the malware detonation environment helped a lot with understanding how traffic moves through the web. that was very beneficial. I think that it's important to kind of develop that in-depth understanding of the underlying technologies. But for a lot of it, I'm self-taught. But Antisyphon is great for especially if you're trying to learn new skills. We have the professional evil application security classes and the API classes that we do through Antisyphon, and those are good ways to kind of help build up that confidence and that experience, I think.
Yeah. Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today with the Antisyphon community, and we appreciate it. So we're going to do the official wrap up. We appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. We do this every Wednesday. Please come back. Jennifer, thank you for continuously coming back and sharing your knowledge. And where we're at. All right.
Woo!
All right, so we're in post-show banter. Jennifer, thanks. I learned a lot today
Yay!
listening, and that's the thing. Like, I don't have a background in cybersecurity, but I've been listening to webcasts for like 8 years, and so whenever I'm like, oh yeah, and no, yeah, and I don't know if you know this, but the person who created Nikto is joining Black Hills.
Really? That's exciting.
Yeah, we're very excited about that.
Ooh.
So when we're like looking through the resume, we're like, let's see, what have they done?
Yeah.
They're like, so that was cool.
I know a lot of times, especially in this field, it's like, oh gosh, maybe I do feel good about this. And then it's like, oh yeah, no, I totally made this or I did that. I'm like, oh, maybe I don't. I don't know if I should be the person that's speaking the same day and same time as you. But we all kind of have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And boy, I don't know if that imposter syndrome ever really goes away though. I just know that fake it till you make it kind of mentality.
Yeah. I'm the co-creator of Backdoors and Breaches, and they have this thing called Play Secure, and even I'm like getting ready to submit a CFP for it, and I'm like, okay, yes, I can talk about gamification of cybersecurity. I can.
Yes.
All right, so we got a couple more questions, and we'll ask those questions, and we'll stick around. I got a quick question for you. You got a class coming up next week. Give us just a real quick, what's it about, and why should someone attend?
So the classes that we have next week, there's 3 of them that are kind of, I think, bundled together. They are part of a whole, the professional evil application security. The idea behind those is that testing applications it can be overwhelming, especially whenever you're first getting into it. I know I've said this about APIs, but there's a lot of moving components to applications, and no application is this, like, they're all different. They're like snowflakes. So the idea behind these is to kind of equip people, one, with the basic understanding of those underlying infrastructure and technologies, and how to interact with them, and how to start identifying potential vulnerabilities in them as well.
One of my favorite questions here is malware detonation? Question mark? What is that? Question mark.
So malware detonation, basically, I take a sample, I'm going to put it in a hopefully secure environment. I say that because, and I'll make a joke afterwards, but that's just me. Whenever I go, I've got the sample, I've got it loaded up on a VM, and I want to see what it does. There's a couple of different ways I can do that. I can go through it and look at it statically. I could pop it into, I just forgot the name of the decompiler.
Me too.
Wow. Oh, and it has the debugger in it called Snowball. So why can I remember that and not IDA? There we go. Sorry.
You got it.
It takes a village.
Yeah.
We helped not at all.
So sometimes I can pop the samples into IDA and I can go through it and figure out what it's doing that way. But a lot of times the fastest way to figure out malware and what it does is just to put it on a machine and then execute it and let it run. So that's the malware detonation. I'm putting it in a secure environment and blowing it up, basically.
Yeah. Do you know about our malware of the day?
No, what?
Yeah. So let me see if I can.
Are we still doing that? Is that still a thing?
Blog malware of the day.
Yeah.
So I'll put that in the chat. The active countermeasure team, they take samples, malware samples. They have, the log files of it. Here's what it looks like and stuff. So
yeah, I will say I definitely there's not I'm in the subsection of people that has a favorite malware. So for anybody
Question.
wondering,
There are
SQL
3
Cipher.
days. We need to register 3 times and pay on 3, or there pay for the 3 days on one shot.
I don't know the answer to that. I am sorry.
Megan, do you know the answer?
Sorry, the answer to that is you have to register for each individual session.
Kelly and Deb, are you seeing any questions that I'm missing?
There's good discussions. Oh, sorry, Deb.
I was gonna say, webcast idea from Zyke. Pick a subject to teach about, but when you read the comics to teach people, you can't say anything that isn't in chat.
Ooh. Ooh.
Just an idea.
That sounds like a an experiment for sure. That's be good for April Fools.
Not recorded anywhere. Yeah.
Did I don't know if I heard any Jason mentioned any experience with Cadeo proxy, CAIDO. I'm not sure exactly what that is.
Proxy Kaido?
Maybe Kaido, CAIDO.
Oh no, Kaido. Okay. I have not used that. Actually, this is my first time hearing about it, but I will definitely go be looking at it now.
Since we're talking about tools, Jennifer, there was another question about Intruder IO on that versus Nessus.
Just the difference between them, or
they're asking if you had used them, if you I'm guessing preferred one or the other, or one is better for certain circumstances.
in general, I think that I prefer Nessus just because it is a little bit more I think what I'm more comfortable with. I have not used Intruder IO, so I can't speak to how well it performs, because it could be fantastic and it could you know, because let's not kid ourselves, Nessus can be quite expensive. So just because I haven't used it, I am hesitant to say, oh, I definitely like one more than the other. It's very much a I think similar to that Zap versus Burp. I think people kind of tend to favor whichever one they learned first.
That kind of like Coke versus Pepsi.
Coke.
Pepsi.
Ginger ale.
Ginger ale. Yeah. Ginger ale.
I just put in the Discord chat, John Strand's giving a webcast tomorrow. And so if you would like to check that out, it's called How to Annoy Attackers Until They Cry. So they cry. Check that out. John's going to be giving previews of active defense and cyber deception. So it's a way of just making attackers' lives absolutely miserable to where they go, you know what? I'll go somewhere else. I'll go somewhere else. So.
Love that idea.
Here's a question from Just Ben. I don't know if you answered this, so correct me if I'm wrong. Have you encountered malware that knows it's in a VM and doesn't behave as you thought?
So keep in mind, I've been with Securitas for 3 years now. So it's been about 3 years since I've really been on the malware scene. My experience with malware is 9 times out of 10, it doesn't care if it's in a VM. And that's because in the modern, and this might be outdated, so please somebody if they know for sure, it's very common for companies to be running some form of their infrastructure or the backbone of their infrastructure in a VM. So because most malware targets organizations rather than the home user, it's going to not necessarily care that it's in a VM. The only malware I've ever seen that has cared if it was in a VM were ones that were targeting home users, because home users aren't generally going to be loading everything in a VM anyways. More often than not, the malware cares if it's in a detonation environment. So it's going to be looking, instead of it being in a VM, things that indicate that it is a VM used for analyzing malware. So if Cuckoo was it's probably still around. It's just not being maintained to the best of my understanding. An open source automated malware detonation environment, the way that it moved its mouse was straight. It would move its mouse to make it look like there was a user, but the problem is that people don't move our mouses. are, we don't move them in straight lines. They're curved. They're all over the place. So malware would be looking for, is it moving in a straight line or is it curved? Or they would be looking to see if the foreground color on the monitor ever changed, to see if there was actually a monitor plugged up to it or if it was a virtual monitor.
Malware is smart.
Yeah, it's super
Good job,
interesting.
malware.
It is, it's an experience in wasting each other's time is what it is.
My first experience with a virus was, like I'm new to computers. Of course I got viruses, but like my favorite virus of all times was the virus that downloaded other viruses, which made my like antivirus go off. And I think I got to 43,000 known viruses. And at that point I was like, it's time to throw the computer away.
So when I
'cause-
first set up honeypots, I think configure is it has, what it does is it downloads the first variant and then that variant downloads B and then C and then D and then so on, and it just kind of keeps downloading itself. So my honeypots very quickly became like just the largest collection of configure. They're like cockroaches. If you have one configure, you have 10.
Didn't you say like you have the malware on USBs like Dexter had blood samples of his victims?
Yeah.
Is it?
They're called Doom. I labeled it as a Doom stick. So I try to label any USB that has malware on it as Doom stick. So that way, hopefully somebody doesn't pick it up and plug it in.
Last question. Recommendations for a 16-year-old cis engineer looking to make change to pen testing. Oh, not a 16-year-old, a 16-year cis engineer looking to make the change. So I was like, wow.
Dude,
thanks for
wow.
being here.
Good job.
I know. I was
Also,
like, how
thanks
did
for
you,
Straight
being
out of the
here.
womb.
how long have you been engineering? So first and foremost, making the change from one area of IT to another is that lateral movement is very challenging. And a lot of times it's that getting your foot in the door that is the hardest part. Unfortunately, it very, very often comes down to the who you know versus what you know. I do recommend if you're looking seriously into getting a job as a pen tester, start networking. What a lot of companies are looking for, I think, more than that real technical skill is the specific mentality of constantly trying to improve and that natural curiosity and that ability to kind of be self-starting. I think that's what a lot of companies are looking for, and it's hard to convey that in a resume. So I think getting out and meeting companies and talking to them is a good way to do that. And honestly, it sounds bad. Don't be afraid to shoot your shot, basically. I applied to a lot of companies that I didn't feel like I was qualified for before one of them was like, okay, yeah, I'll interview you. And that's really kind of how I got my start is I kept putting myself out there. It was uncomfortable. I didn't like it. It felt bad. But I just kept telling myself, oh, the worst they could say is no, right?
Yeah.
And eventually I found a company that was willing to, they were like, okay, yeah, we see the mentality that we like to see in you. So that was my first cybersecurity company. And now I'm at Secure Ideas, who very much looked at me and said the same thing, like, wow, we think that you definitely have what it takes to do excellent at this job. So
You found a great home there.
Yeah.
We have great
Keep
ideas.
trying.
One suggestion from Black Hills, because we hire pen testers and people want to be pen testers. And so they ask, start practicing doing write-ups of your CTF challenges.
yes.
Because the report
Yes.
is the important part, right? Like that's what people are paying for. They pay for the report. Your hacking is fantastic, but the report is what the client pays for. And so if you are doing CTF challenges, like try to hack me, hack the box and things like that, screenshot, report as you go, put together, like, here's how I did it. Here's my methodology here. And most importantly, please, all the things that did not work. So putting things that did not work in your report is just as important as putting things that did work in your report.
Absolutely. And I definitely second that. And especially on the putting things that don't work just as much as the things that do work, because there are going to be tests you'll encounter that have no findings on them. And what do I say in the report? So it's really helpful to get used to talking about things that you did not succeed at, because I can at least show the client, look, I did all of these things and this is how well you handled it. So they can at least feel confident that I actually did my job.
Yeah. Actually, I do have one last question for you on that note, and then we'll be done.
Okay.
And this is I'm sorry, I'm going to ask this question. I asked this to BB. It's got a lot of weight to it, and I apologize ahead of time. When you're on a pen test and you do not succeed, do you feel like it's their security, or is it you lacking the skill and ability to do it?
It depends.
Okay.
There are definitely times where I'm going to use network pen test as an example. There is, despite my degree being in networking, I am not nearly as well versed in network pen testing as I am web apps or APIs. So there are times on a network pen test where I'm like, I feel like I'm not doing good enough on this. And this is one of the things that I appreciate the most about being at Secure Ideas. One, I do know what I'm doing. It's just because I feel like I don't do them as much, or I'm not as well versed in them, that I'm failing much more than I am. But another really great thing about Secure Ideas is that my coworkers have different experience than I do. So my direct manager, Eric Kuhn, did Active Directory for major companies, major banks. Like, he was the one that built and implemented their Active Directory. So if I'm stuck on something Active Directory, I can go, Eric, do you have like 30 minutes to talk about this? This is everything I've done. I don't know if I'm missing something. And he's usually able very quickly to say, no, you did exactly what you should have done. That's exactly right. Or maybe try doing it this way instead. So having that resource to kind of reach out to and talk to other people and bounce the ideas off of has helped me a lot with that. Oh God, I'm just failing everywhere. And now I feel much more confident after those small conversations saying, okay, yeah, no, I am. I do actually know what I'm doing. It's just, sometimes it's hard to convince yourself of that.
Yeah. And I appreciate you answering that question. I know when I ask it, like, it brings up all kinds of feelings. And so for the people who are listening, like, yeah, all of us, each and every one of us. And so if you don't quite have that sounding board yet, I would recommend that's what networking's for. That's what doing CTFs are for. That's for finding teams and people to do that with. So that way,
in our community, our Discord communities that we have.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I have people from like competitors that I've taught classes to a couple of years ago. And every now and then, like, somebody will reach out to me like, hey, I'm running into this issue on a test. Like, do you have any ideas about that? And I'll be like, yeah, let's, obviously we address it delicately since it's a pen test that they're doing. We don't want to cross any NDAs, or we take that very seriously, but I will do my best to kind of ask them questions and guide them in the right direction with what information they are able to give me. So we're more than happy to. We don't charge to answer questions.
Yeah.
Well, everyone, that is post-show banter. Thank you for sticking around, the 350 of you. We appreciate it. Hopefully you would join us for the summit, and hopefully you'll submit to the CFP, because we would love to hear you share your knowledge with the community. And not all CFPs will be selected, but once you do submit a CFP, you get on the mailing list to then submit to future CFPs.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you all so much. We'll see you next time. That's it for us. Ryan, kill it with fire. Come on, Ryan. Do it.
Bye.
Kill it, Ryan.